Like, I get that, especially when, the tax wasn't going up for things like that. But I think that the problem is, I get this, it's funny, but, like, rhetoric like this is incendiary, and it's impossible to be able to, reach across the divide to be able to convert people when all you're doing is calling people cunts. Like, sure, people who earn above 80k or members of the bourgeoisie or whatever, I do not give a shit about their opinions, and if they're selfish, then whatever. They're sending their material interests, and we have to change the economic superstructure. But calling working people who vote Tory stupid, it ignores the overarching fact of cultural hegemony and the manufactured consent that comes from living in a media class whose material interest themselves is to engender right-wing spirit amongst voters, whether it be through deception or whether it be through outright lying or whether it be through rhetoric or whatever. Like, people get caught up in a bunch of issues that most people who vote don't pay that much attention to politics. They just look at the parties and say, oh, this happened, I heard some stories, put an X in the box. It's about changing the narrative and building a movement and bringing people across that point of view. Like, when people talk about, I want to get all the immigrants out, we have to offer an alternative premise rather than just calling people racist. Because at the end of the day, most people who say bad stuff about immigration or whatever aren't doing so because of some kind of deep-seated... I mean, it's racist and it's bad and we should call it out, but they don't do it from some kind of deep-seated hatred of minorities or whatever. They're just all part of the manufactured consent that's been brought to them by, like, media hegemony. Do you see what I mean? It's different. You have to treat people who've been indoctrinated into this viewpoint with the kid gloves that it needs to be able to move them along the line. And that's why I really like the idea of debate, because you can, if you like, making fools of people with strong conservative opinions is a really good way of optically putting your opinions across to people. I mean, JC did seem like our last chance, but I think there's still time. There's still time. Like, we should have to get rid of Keith. Because Keith's awful. And you've got to understand that also, it's not just about yearly income in these cases. A lot of the vast majority of the Tory vote comes from retirees, right? Now, if you look at the voting demographics from the voter survey post-election in 2019, once you remove retirees, the only demographic that voted majority Tory was those people earning over 100k. It was only when you included retirees that, people on the lower income started voting more Tory. Because, again, it's all about material interests. It's all about the material interests of these particular voting demographics. You look at people who are retired. All of these Labour policies that are to do with the working population doesn't matter to them. They've stopped working now. Or where their money comes from is from making sure pensions are good and making sure their property values rise. So it just so happens that the interests of the corporate landlord class are intertwined with the interests of the retiree class, of retired people, because their main asset or assets are the house or houses that they own. A lot of people, a very large portion of landlords in this country are accidental landlords who've just been passed down property through generations, especially since we had this paradigm of being closer to home ownership before, the Thatcherite period, where they sold the fall of the council accommodation and things became more privatised, right? Where people would pass down houses, and now there's an additional revenue income stream for them as landlords, right? So a lot of these people, they've worked hard all their life, they have a house, and that's the only thing they see. There's when they look at the political process, not seeing it through the lens of Labour, through the lens of working class politics. All they're looking at through is whatever cultural bollocks being pumped into them by Sky News and GB News, and also the value of their home, right? So they may not have even been privileged their whole life. They may have been salt of the earth working people for their whole life. I do not doubt that. But the old paradigm was that even salt of the earth working people could become homeowners because the housing market wasn't fucked. So that's why, as they've gone through life, their material interests have changed away from Labour policy and towards Conservative policy, which is why they're voting why voting trends have changed in for these particular people, because that's how most people view society. They just go, oh well, I guess this is what I need now, so I'm going to vote for this party because they have policies that appeal to what I want. Right? Do you see what with the previous person I talked about before, who only became disabused with the Conservatives because they'd introduced a policy that negatively affected them? Because that's what most people look at when they are engaging in the electoral system. And I and again, I do think there was obviously. I remember I was talking about the people who had this awful views towards this council tenant. Yeah, sure, there are plenty of people like that out there as well. But there are plenty of people who just vote Conservative because that's what's in their own material interest to do so. And we have to understand, and sure, that's why the culture war is so powerful, because it obfuscates politics away from talking about these, economic superstructures. So, for example, I did a tweet a time ago when they were talking about, for example, the police and crime bill, which is starting to criminalise protest. Now, a lot of people are talking about this through the lens of the idea that the Tories just want an unaccountable totalitarian state. And I think that is that's missing the wood for the trees. I think it's a lot more simple than that. Because what a lot of people, especially people who've worked hard their whole life, and they are retirees and they have a house now, they just want to live in peace. They want to have their little nest egg that they've got and their little comfortable little idyllic life that they say they've worked hard for. I don't doubt that they've worked hard for, right? They want to keep that and make it as worry-free as possible. Having to hear about protests being inconvenienced by people, sitting in the middle of the road, seeing the entirety of London blocked by Extinction Rebellion, all these protests and things that are quote-unquote annoyances, as was said in the police and crime bill. These are all things that disrupt that. They disrupt the easy life that you get post-retirement if you've got a house and you've got a good pension, because they remember these people have defined benefit pensions rather than defined contribution schemes like we have, like the really shitty pensions that millennials have. So I just think it's something. It's incredibly banal and bland, and they're just appealing to the voting interests of a large swath of people who don't want to have their nice, cozy little life disrupted by protest. I think it's a little bit more simple than some, nasty scheme to become a totalitarian police state, although it is becoming one, because as people's material conditions deteriorate, they become more irate and they become more likely to protest, and I think they understand that too, but they don't do it because they think that these people need to be, they have some kind of detestable viewpoint towards these people. They just want to be able to keep a voter base on board with this tough on crime narrative, which doesn't really solve the issues with crime, which get solved through social welfare programs. I'm no fan of New Labour, but you have to admit that they at least the level to which they did some social programs, and eliminating child poverty, for example, did reduce the crime rate. At least in the first couple of Blair terms. But you got to think of it, Mr. Willis, that or Mr. Willis, sorry, that it's more complicated than just an income of £80,000 or more. Because the retired people who benefit from Tory policy, who were working class originally, they don't see themselves as rich. Because, they're not in the grand scheme of things. They're not part of the bourgeois. They're just retired people who want the value of their house to increase. They can pass it on to their kids, right? It's more complicated than just rich people. And I think we missed the forest for the trees when we talk about it's just rich versus poor, because these people still see themselves as working class, because in the UK we have this fucking bastardized idea of what class means, where it's not an economic relationship to the means of production, some kind of tangible, quantifiable idea. Is this messy vibe about people wearing flat caps and people who go to the races or whatever, when that's not what it is. We have this fucking grotesque idea that there's a metropolitan liberal elite who are pushing in identity politics and they're all privileged, like cosseted middle class children, when they're not. They're, people working at H&M for 8.5K a year, paying half their income in rent with no expendable income. Like, you look at what was I going to say there? These people are meaningfully working class. They do not have any assets. They work for a living, and they get half their income extracted from them. Yet, because they are socially progressive, they get treated like some kind of elite because, apparently they agree with corporations on the fact that racism is bad. Like, it's this. Whereas it's a completely idealistic understanding of class rather than a material understanding of class, and it completely obfuscates our ability to engage, to be able to organize on class lines, as people don't understand. We need to get people to understand where materially they need to look at policy and say sure, like, does your life get any better if you lock people up for protests, or does it actually get better if you have higher wages, if you have a better foot on the ladder, if social mobility is higher, right? True, yeah, nearly everyone in this country is working class. You're absolutely right. Look, the term middle class is a fucking bullshit phrase that makes no sense because, you just have to, like, I think bourgeoisie, proletariat, landlord, labor aristocracy. These are all terms that have a much more concrete and quantifiable meaning than just talking about the vibes of people, what they give off. Does that make them working or middle class, right? Like, because I can understand, like, especially when you lived up through, like, the 70s and 80s, where members of the bourgeois would treat working class people bad based upon the cultural trappings that surrounded it, like all this working men clubs type stuff, and, all of these kind of, the working class signifiers that we would look at today that don't have a material basis but an idealistic basis. So people's understanding of the working class existence is different 50 years ago than what it is now, but the media doesn't want to realise that, in that it's not all people wearing flat caps and going to working men's clubs anymore. That's a relic of the past that may still get denigrated. Like, working class existence and people calling people chavs, like the Owen Jones book is really good. Like, that's still a denigration of working class existence because it's something that is related to the material working class, right? Because this is how people understood. This is the kind of cultural things that surrounded the working class previously, but it doesn't correlate to where the working class exists nowadays, because it's a whole breadth of people. Just because someone is well spoken and has progressive social views or whatever, that doesn't make them not working class, right? It is a relationship to the means of production, which makes it so that myself, being someone who works in a call center, is quite well spoken or whatever, I have exactly the same interests, like the quantifiable material interests, as a brickie or someone who someone who works some guy who works in a factory somewhere. And you know what, absolutely, people who mock these people for something that sounds working class. Like, I was having a thread on Twitter about Al Murray, the pub landlord. Someone was saying, I think it's funny that he got all the gammons to think he wasn't a parody, and I'm just like, is it really on? Is it really a good look for like a public school boy, son of like military generals who went to Oxford, is suddenly a posh guy, is suddenly his brand of humour is just pretending to be working class, and that's the joke? Like, is that really that funny? Just like acting like a stereotypical working class person. Is that a good joke? I don't think it is. Like, and it serves to further demonise people. Like, everybody should go read Chavs by Owen Jones. It's a really good summary of the way in which the cultural, like, signifiers that we have for class get denigrated in society in general. Although we also have people who denigrate, the metropolitan liberal elite kind of working class people. But hey ho, it's difficult because there's always like some kind of scapegoat to draw our ire away from the bourgeois and draw our ire away from the actual elites who control everything towards some mythical cultural enemy that distracts people from these actual interests. It's difficult. But in general, that posters like that, I don't think win any favours. It's funny to pass through leftist groups or whatever. I think it's funny, but I don't think it's good optics to engage in things like this, which is frustrating because I want to call Tories cunts all the time because a lot of them just act like cunts. But I understand that that's just manufactured consent at the end of the day. Yeah, divide and conquer, absolutely. It's a tale as old as time.